Hello everyone. We're going to travel across the Pacific Ocean tonight and discover a myth of the Polynesian peoples from Aotearoa, also known as New Zealand, to Hawaii, Tahiti, and more places. We will also discuss what is known of the Polynesians' migration and settlement in islands that are separated by thousands of miles of ocean. But let's begin with the first story. The story of hero and demigod Maui, and I'll tell you more about its significance afterwards. Once upon a time, so long ago that the grandfathers of our grandfathers didn't live in these times, the world looked very different. There were less islands back then. Birds were invisible. Day and night were unpredictable. And sometimes the sun disappeared unexpectedly, which made farming and fishing more difficult. All the more that men had not yet discovered the secret of fire, and they had to live in complete darkness at night. The heavens were also very close to the earth, which left little room for people to live and for plants to grow. At the time, gods and mortals mingled with each other. Sometimes they fell in love and they had children. It happened one day that the moon goddess Inakawea got married with a village chief, and together they had 4 sons. The first 3 were born as normal humans, but the last of them, Maui, inherited some of his mother's divine nature. He was part human being and part god. He could shift shape and appear as a man or an animal, and far from being shy and cautious, Maui liked to use his power to play pranks, and he would ridicule anyone, man or god, who dared to displease him. He could be annoying and arrogant sometimes, but he also had a good heart and was never intentionally mean. So he was also well liked by his parents and siblings, even though his different nature made him an outcast, and he soon developed a reputation of trickster in the village. Sometimes his 3 brothers excluded him from their activities, especially their fishing expeditions. The 3 brothers were excellent fishermen and often brought back enough fish to feed the entire village, whereas Maui was weird and he had the reputation of being bad at fishing and bringing bad luck, so they wouldn't let him go with them on their boat. He tried everything to make them accept him, from temper tantrums to threats, until they accepted just for the sake of silencing him. And so for once, the 4 brothers one day went fishing together, Maui proudly standing at the forefront of their boat, ready to show his abilities. To put the odds on his side, he had taken with him a magical fishing hook, and as a bait, he had taken also a feather from his mother's pet bird. But unfortunately, things didn't go as planned. The four brothers started fishing, but instead of achieving a lot of catches, as usual, they waited and waited, and nothing happened. They grew hungry, and they started to blame Maui for bringing them bad luck and not delivering on the fabulous promises of abundant catch he had made. Maui had not used his magical hook yet, and that was his last card to play. So, as usual, he remained apparently confident and promised his brothers that he would make a huge catch. The three were skeptical, and they ordered him to stop talking and act, giving him one last chance to prove his worth. Maui casted his hook and threw the line. The magical hook fell to the ocean floor, and at first nothing happened, until suddenly Maui felt a mighty tug. Thinking he had caught a huge fish, he began to reel in his catch. But this proved very difficult, and he had to ask for help from his brothers. They were now all excited. What kind of giant fish or sea creature could resist so much? And would they be able to take it out of water? Maui ordered his three older brothers to paddle hard and strong to ensure a firm fishing line as he placed all his strength on reeling. The line slowly rose, but it took huge effort, and the day soon ended. The brothers stayed focused, and they kept paddling for the entire night, until the following day. The line was slowly rising and rising, but apparently their prey was still not abandoning the fight. For another entire day and an entire night, they kept drawing on the line, only focused on paddling and moving forward, until they were so exhausted that they could no longer move. And at this point, the brothers looked behind them. It was not a fish that the hook had caught. It was the ocean floor, and they had made it rise well above the sea. Several new islands, with peaks and valleys, revealed themselves. Unintentionally, and with the help of his brothers, Maui had made the bottom of the ocean rise so much that a new land had appeared. Polynesia was born. But the world was still different from what it would become. Maui had modeled it unintentionally, just by trying to prove his worth to his brothers. And on another episode, he did it again to please his mother. Hina, the goddess, liked to behave like a normal woman, and while male villagers went fishing, building, or hunting, she had her daily tasks. She wove, she cooked, and she kept her home clean and welcoming. But she complained that her workday was limited because there were few sunshine hours. the world was illuminated by La, the sun god, and La was agitated. He crossed the sky very fast and then disappeared for a long time, plunging the world into darkness. Some days he was so fast that daylight lasted only a few hours. Other times he was slower, but this was completely unpredictable, and it made the world a difficult place to inhabit. Maui wanted to help his mother, so he decided to do something about it. He took again his magical hook and wove a long and solid rope, and then he went to Haleakala, the house of the sun, the place where the sun god rested between his erratic crossings of the sky. La was powerful and burning hot, but using his powers, his hook, and acting when the sun was asleep, Maui managed to capture him, and he tied him to a tree. La begged to be released, as the god felt the need to move and could not stand staying prisoner. Maui accepted, on the condition that the god would now fly high into the heavens and would slow down his course to remain visible for as many hours as he disappeared, each day and each night until the end of times. La accepted, and since then we live in a world where night and day are regular. But the night was still very dark, so using again his hook, Maui placed the moon into the night sky. The moon would provide a softer light, and mankind would never again have to live in complete darkness. The effects of Maui's good deeds immediately appeared. The villagers could lead more productive and happy lives. They could plan for their days, do more things, and never had to be afraid of the night again. After the creation of new islands, this new exploit had gained Maui the respect and affection of many, and he liked it, so he decided to do more for them. The world was still far from perfect. Another problem was that the sky was very low back then. It was like an invisible ceiling that you could reach by climbing a tree. In some higher parts of the islands that emerged from the infinite sea around them, it was impossible to stand up, and people had to walk on their hands and knees. This made fishing, hunting, planting and harvesting a constant struggle. And even worse, the sky was slowly falling. What would happen when it would reach the earth and room for mankind would have entirely disappeared? Maui felt sad for the earthlings, and he wanted to help. So he set out to move this falling sky. This time, no one could have used force to revert the sky's fall. It was just too large and too heavy. But what physical strength couldn't do, spiritual energy might be able to achieve. Maui's father was an expert in this field, and Maui sought his help. They sat down, facing each other, and they combined their spiritual strength, lifting their spirits to the sky and pushing as strong as they could. The sky was so imposing that it didn't move at first, but they kept trying, and their combined energy began to work. There was a huge noise. The wind began to blow and shake every tree on earth as people ran around, terrified. The earth trembled, slowly at first, and then faster and faster. The sky began to move up and up and up, so high that no human being would never reach it again, even the birds. People who were walking on their knees could stand upright. The top of the trees that previously touched the sky could suddenly soar with majesty, and as the noise of the sky moving up faded away, it was replaced with the cheering sounds of people and the happy chirping of birds who could now fly freely. The world had been saved and expanded beyond human imagination, all thanks to Maui. In this new, expanded and freer world, birds sang and flied more than ever. But people didn't know it. At the time, birds were invisible. People could hear them as they populated the trees. Sometimes they could feel the wind made by their wings, but no one had ever seen a bird, except Maui. One of his powers was the ability to see birds, and he not only delighted in their melodious music, he also liked to observe their colors and their variety of shapes. But no one could join him in enjoying this vision, and this made Maui aware of the limitations of human condition. Even though there were now more islands, day and night were regular, and people had more room to live. Human life remained spiritually and materially very limited. And so he thought about giving more to his human friends that he felt compassion for. He prepared a spell that would bless every human and give them the ability to see birds, and beyond, a chance to realize that there was more to the world than the visible, that beauty could be within the reach of anyone who was able to see beyond appearances. The spell worked, and since then we can see birds, and through this vision we get a clue, an invitation to elevate ourselves in many possible senses of the term, aesthetically, sentimentally, spiritually. Maui had now acquired more wisdom and had grown a lot after all these good deeds, and he thought of yet another gift that would immensely benefit humanity. Men had not yet mastered the secret of fire. They sometimes had fire that they found when they could collect embers of natural fires, or when a volcano erupted, but they didn't know how to create it, and so they often lost the flames when it rained or when someone forgot to feed them. When this happened, they had to walk or hike on dozens of miles to find another source of fire, and they lived in constant fear of losing the precious source of light and heat. The secret of fire was unknown to men, but not to everyone. There was a tribe of intelligent birds who knew how to create it, and their chief was a mud hen, a bird looking a bit like a duck. Mud hens appeared in the winter and flew to another part of the world in the summer. But this bird was not a regular one. Like Maui, it was a half-divine creature that had taken disappearance, and it had more power and knowledge than most creatures. Maui had acquired more strength and will than any other, save for the gods, and he traveled to the place where the tribe of birds lived, with the intention to confront their leader and get the secret of creating fire. When he found the tribe and asked to talk to their chief, the creature refused to reveal the secret. So Maui began to strangle it. The bird knew that the secret to creating fire was rubbing two sticks together. But this secret was very precious, and it didn't want to let it spread. So it deliberately directed Maui to rub the wrong sticks together, and tried to convince him that it didn't work only because he was not gifted enough. Maui didn't believe it, and grew angry at the mud hen's deceit. So he strangled with more intensity, and the bird finally submitted and told Maui to use 2 sticks of kiawe wood, which was the right type of wood. It worked, and the secret was finally revealed. But Maui decided to punish the bird for its deceitful behavior. So he rubbed the head and the neck of the bird with a flaming stick. This left the mud hen and its lineage with a bald head, and to this day their bald heads remind us of the bird's reluctance to reveal the secrets of fire. Maui shared the secret with humanity, and again improved our condition. Maui had accomplished great deeds and become benevolent, but his natural arrogance had not disappeared. It had even grown after such impressive exploits. And this arrogance was the cause that led to his demise. Maui was now revered and as close to a god as a demigod could be. But he was still mortal, and he couldn't ignore that with the passing of time, his body was aging. He became obsessed and repulsed by the idea of death, and so he became interested in ways to find immortality for himself and for mankind. But how could mortals achieve immortality? Life and death were under the guard of goddess Hine, the guardian of life. Hine was the guardian of the underworld. She decided when a life had to end, and the mere thought of death from her was enough to kill any living creature. The only option was to kill Hine, to kill death itself, so that every living being could be freed from her tyranny. But this looked very difficult. How to approach and kill a goddess that could kill you with a single look or a single thought. Maui planned to approach her when she would be asleep. He would become immaterial and enter her body, then steal her heart while exiting, which would kill her. But he needed help, allies, to stand guard while he would approach Hine in her sleep. So he told his brothers of his plan and asked them for help. He would turn them into birds. They would sing to Hine to make her fall asleep, and they would keep an eye on the goddess while she slept and while Maui approached. The plan was audacious, and the brothers were terrified at the idea of approaching the guardian of life and defying the order of things. What could be their punishment if they were caught? But he managed to convince them, and so it was done. As the goddess fell asleep, Maui became immaterial and approached her, entering her body as a spirit. But before he could steal her heart, one of the birds realized that defying the laws of nature was the greatest crime possible, even for a demigod, and he betrayed his brother. He emitted a loud sound that woke the goddess up. As soon as Hine came back from the land of sleep, Maui, who was still inside her body, was killed. The greatest hero ever had fallen, and lost what time he had left to live in his quest for immortality. Maui is universally known and respected as a legendary hero and demigod throughout the Polynesian world, from New Zealand to Hawaii, Tahiti, Tonga, or Samoa. But because these different cultures have lived separately for a long time, many centuries, there is a great deal of variation in the representation of Maui and the details of his exploits, even though the main lines are similar. I have followed more the tradition from Hawaii in the story I just told you. But for example, to the Maori, he lifted from the ocean floor one of the islands of New Zealand, while in the Hawaiian tradition, Maui lifted the islands from the Hawaiian archipelago. Often he is depicted as a handsome young man, but in Tahiti he was a wise and older man, a kind of prophet. But there is no doubt that all these myths have the same origin. Specifically in the case of Maui, they could be traced back to the western limits of Polynesia, to islands near New Guinea. There is a lot to say about who the Polynesians are, because they share common origins. We will also see the differences between Melanesia, Polynesia, Micronesia, and I'll tell you more stories. But before, let's take a minute to find a comfortable position and relax. As always, you can listen with your eyes closed, and there are timestamps on your screen and in the first comment pinned under this video if you wish to navigate between the chapters of the story. In the same command, there are links to music streaming services like Spotify if you'd rather listen to my stories there. I made playlists by themes. You can listen and fall asleep to them. And also a link to Patreon if you wish to support this channel. On Patreon you get updates, you can download everything I make, and you contribute to keep this channel free of ad breaks before, during, and after videos. And now, let's return to mythology and everything we have to discuss. I'll go on with another myth, this time from the Maori tradition, that explains the origin of the world and many gods. This is the story of the primal couple, Rangi and Papa. This happened long before the time of Maui, when the world was still young and only a handful of primal gods lived in it. Two of them, the Sky Father, Rangi, and the Earth Mother, Papa, married and formed a tight union, an union so strong that they lived locked together in a tight embrace, and between them, between sky and earth, only a very small and dark space could exist. They had children, over 70 children, all gods like their parents. But their children could only live in the cramped darkness between them, while the Sky Father and the Earth Mother stayed entirely absorbed in their mutual love, oblivious of anything else around or between them. Even though they had little space and only knew darkness, the children grew and started to discuss among themselves what it could be like to live in the light. The fiercest of the children was Tumatawenga, the god of war and hunting. Following his impulsive nature, he proposed that the best solution to their predicament was to kill their parents, to get free from them. But his brother Tane disagreed. Tane was the god of forests and birds, and he was more inspired by harmony and survival. He suggested that it would be better to push them apart. Rangi, the sky, would become a stranger to them and be placed above their heads, whereas Papa, the earth, who lied under Rangi, would remain below to nurture them. Other gods agreed with Tane and put his plan into action. The god of cultivated food, Rongo, the god of the sea, Tangaroa, the god of wild food, Auniatikeke, they all stood up and tried to push up Rangi with their hands. But the Sky Father would not budge, nor even notice the effort of his children, absorbed as he was in his love of Papa and her sweet embrace. And their children didn't have enough strength to separate their parents. After many attempts, Tane, the god of forests, had an idea. Instead of standing upright and pushing with his hands, He lied on his back and pushed with his strong legs. He pushed and pushed until suddenly a ray of light crossed the darkness. In a deafening noise, Rangi and Papa began to drift apart. The unexpected separation had taken them by surprise, and they cried of grief and pain as the world between them filled with light and their children discovered its beauty. From the breaking of this primal love, the separation of sky and earth, our world appeared, and for the first time the gods had space to move, fly and breathe as much as they wanted. Their joy contrasted with the despair and cries of their parents, and Rangi started crying, sending abundant rain to the body of his wife, the earth. The gods were too happy about their liberation to notice the pain of their parents, except one, Tawhirimatea, the god of storms and winds. He was angered that their parents had been torn apart and couldn't stand hearing their desperate cries. All knew that what had been done could not be undone, but Tawhirimatea pledged that from this moment on, they would all have to deal with his anger. He left his siblings on earth and flew off to the sky to join Rangi and prepare his attack. And so in this new world, before the first day even ended, war had appeared. A war between gods that would rage in heaven and on earth. In the sky, Tawhirimatea fathered an army of children, many winds, clouds, including whirlwinds, gloomy thick clouds, hurricane clouds, and thunderstorm clouds, and rain, and mist, and fog. He launched his first attack against the one god guilty of the separation of Rangi and Papa, Tane, the god of forests. The forests of the world were taken in storms, and as dust flied everywhere, even the great forest trees of Tane were smashed and fell to the ground. Then Tawhirimatea turned his anger to Tangaroa, the god of the seas. Huge waves rose, whirlpools formed, and Tangaroa fled in panic. While the god of storms prepared his attack and fathered ever more children, so did the other gods who lived on earth. And Tangaroa had had two grandchildren, Ikatere, the father of fish, and Tuteweiwei, the ancestor of reptiles. Both were terrified by the attack of the storm god, and so Ikatere and his creations, fish, found shelter under the sea. But reptiles instead escaped to the forest, to the realm of Tane, abandoning their ancestor, the god of the sea. Tane and Tangaroa had cordial relations until this point, but Tangaroa was angry that his brother gave refuge to his runaway children, the reptiles, and their relations soared. Since then, Tane of the forest supplies men with canoes, nets, and fish hooks to catch the descendants of Tangaroa living underwater. And Tangaroa retaliates by swamping canoes and sweeping away houses, land and trees that are washed out to sea in floods. This eternal conflict between the two, that still rages on to this day, began during the first war of all times. But this is not the only conflict that was born in these times. Tawhirimatea, who had already weakened Tane of the forests and Tangaroa of the sea, turned his attention to other gods. The gods of food, both cultivated and wild, and also Tu, the father of humankind. The gods were starting to organize to withstand his attacks, and when came the turn of Tu, the father of humans, the god was able to resist and repel the fury of the winds and clouds. The anger of the gods subsided, and the world began to find a new balance, began to return to peace. But this peace is never entirely guaranteed. The feud of storms, forests, and sea continues to happen, and humankind has an active part in it, like trees, fish, or reptiles. The father of humans, too, thought about the actions of other gods in separating their parents, and their cowardice when they went into hiding during the attacks of Tawhirimatea. And so the descendants of Tu, humans, keep repaying the other gods for their flaws. They capture the birds, the children of Tane, and they use forests as building materials or fuel. They capture fish under the waters of Tangaroa. They eat food and use wild plants to weave baskets or build their roofs. So Tu eats a little bit of all his brothers to repay them for their past actions, and he subdued each of them using his descendants, the men. The only one he could never subdue is Tawhirimatea, and for this reason, storms and hurricanes keep attacking mankind to this day. And so appeared our world, one of beauty, land, sea, where ancient conflicts continue between the gods, and beyond them, the primal elements they represent. And since then, all gods were freed from the embrace of earth and sky. All except one. There was one last child of Rangi and Papa, who was never born, and still lives inside Papa, underground. Whenever this child is kicking, the earth shakes, and this is what causes an earthquake. His name is Ruaumoko, and he is the god of earthquakes and volcanoes. Separated forever, Rangi and Papa continue to grieve for each other. When it rains, it is Rangi's tears that fall towards Papa. At night, when the sky appears illuminated by countless stars, these are lights that Tane threw, along with the sun and the moon, to appropriately dress his father. And through a long and conflictual genealogy, we are all the descendants of Tu, the son of Rangi and Papa. The earth and the sky are our ancestors. So let's talk about Polynesia and where these myths come from and how they spread. First, what is Polynesia? It is not a country or a continent, but rather a region of the Pacific Ocean, made of mainly ocean and more than 1,000 islands. It is sometimes called the Polynesian Triangle. The islands are within a very big triangle with roughly Hawaii to the north, Rapa Nui, also known as Easter Island, and French Polynesia, especially Tahiti, in the east, and New Zealand, Aotearoa, Tonga, and Samoa in the west. The distances are huge within the triangle, thousands of miles, and yet the natives from these islands are a group of closely related people, related culturally by their beliefs, by their myths and legends, related linguistically. Their languages have all evolved separately, but they have a common origin, and related genetically, because they descend from different waves of migration that have colonized this large region over several centuries. So, what happened, and where do Polynesians come from? Polynesians are a subset of Austronesian people, and Austronesians are a broader group of peoples that can be traced back 5,000 years ago from the island of Taiwan. Taiwan nowadays is mainly populated by Han Chinese because there was a migration from the continent, but indigenous Taiwanese people came from Southeast Asia and they settled on the island. So why consider Taiwan a starting point then? Because it is there that a number of inventions took place. The inhabitants began to invent ocean-going sailing technology. As far as we know, they were the first on Earth. Inventions like catamarans, outrigger boats, or the crab claw sail, which is a type of triangular sail, very efficient and good to maneuver. These discoveries happened over several centuries, and using them, the Austronesians from Taiwan began to migrate by the sea between 3000 and 1500 BC. They used the land they discovered as a base to continue their expansion. They reached the Philippines, Southeast Asia, where they had come from, and beyond. To the west, they went as far as Madagascar, on the other side of the Indian Ocean. To the south, they reached New Zealand, and to the east, Hawaii, and their maximal known expansion is Easter Island, Rapa Nui, in the Southeast Pacific. But even though this is unproven, it is not impossible that they also reached America by the Pacific Ocean. Culturally and linguistically, they diverged because of the distances, the passing of time. A large family that is spoken by almost 400 million people. The languages with the most speakers are Indonesian and Malaysian, but more than 1,000 different languages exist. And ethnically, Austronesians can look very different. Some look East Asian, almost like Chinese Han. Others are very dark-skinned in a subregion called Melanesia, and they could be mistaken as Africans, and in between there are many variations. Austronesia was divided into subregions by European explorers and ethnologists in the 19th century, based on the appearance of inhabitants and the perceived cultural similarities and differences. So these categories are not necessarily always that pertinent, but they stayed. In the Pacific there are three main cultural areas populated by Austronesians. Polynesia is the largest one, and west of it there is Micronesia, which includes the Mariana Islands, Kiribati, the Marshall Islands, and also Melanesia, with New Guinea, the Solomon Islands, Fiji, and New Caledonia. Actually, Polynesia was named by Europeans too. It comes from Greek, meaning multiple islands, and the term was coined as Polynésie by a French writer in the 18th century, and it passed to English as Polynesia. In their different languages, the Polynesians have adopted the term, and it is generally considered that it makes cultural sense because the branch of Austronesians that migrated to Polynesia did not completely lose its unity. They encountered islands that were often unpopulated, and so they kept a lot of common cultural traits, as exemplified by their myths, which have variations, but their common origin is obvious. Or their languages, they are not the same, but they are audibly close. This migration into Polynesia took centuries. It began about 3,000 years ago, around 900 BC, as far as we know, beginning with the Samoa and Tonga Islands, and then jumping from island to island, the Polynesians spread to the east and south over 2,000 years. Hawaii was reached around 900 AD, a bit more than a millennium ago, and the last significant island to be colonized was probably Easter Island during the European Middle Ages. But the move was not straightforward. For example, New Zealand received a wave of migration, and 5 centuries later, it became a base of migrants who sometimes returned to where their ancestors had come from. Between these islands, there are often hundreds of miles of ocean, sometimes thousands in the case of Easter Island. So their capacity to travel such long distances at the time is really very impressive. They had a knowledge of astronomy that helped them navigate, but their boats were small. They couldn't know for sure whether they would find a land to inhabit. And actually, with these huge distances between the different parts of Polynesia, the conscience of being part of the same ethno-linguistic group is quite recent for Polynesians. Until the 19th century, there were no contacts between the peoples who lived in the different corners of the Polynesian Triangle. And yet, their social structures, their belief, their art, the stories they told, were very closely apparented because they had all the same root. Now let's return to storytelling and continue the journey we began before with Rangi and Papa, the Sky Father and the Earth Mother. I told you that this was a Maori narrative, even though elements of it also appear across Polynesia. The story didn't end with the war between gods and the rise of Tu, the father of man. There is more. And to begin with, the creation of the first woman and the appearance of death in the world. All the children of Rangi and Papa were males, the dozens of them. And even though they had a mother, they ignored that beings could be dual, as all of them were born male. Even humans were all male, but they didn't fear disappearance because at the time death did not exist yet, and every creature had the eternity for itself, or so they thought. The first child of earth and heaven to feel desire was Tane, the god of forests and birds. The war of gods had slowed down and was replaced with this new balance we talked about before, an eternal conflict that pitched forest and plants against sea and against storms and winds and against mankind, who would forever live eating a bit of each but exposed to their dangers. The world would never be quiet and peaceful again, but it was stable in a sense, and this cycle was set to last forever. And so Tane became bored and developed the desire to find a partner, a counterpart, someone to share his days. He went to ask his mother, Papa, and she instructed him to fashion a female form from earth. Tane did it, and when he was pleased with the shape he had sculpted, he breathed life into it. The first woman, Hine Aotearoa, was born. She was everything he desired, and the two mated. After this, they had a daughter, a second woman, Hine Atawira. Hine Aotearoa had not extinguished Tane's desire, and so he took his own daughter as a second wife. And to be able to do so, he hid from her the secret of her origins. Hine Atawira grew up, ignoring who her father was. One day, while Tane was absent, Hine began to wonder who her father could be, and she overheard a conversation that made her understand that her own husband was also her father. This made her feel ashamed and disgusted, and she ran away before Tane returned. She went to the underworld to hide, and she claimed it for herself, becoming Hine, the guardian of life, the same Hine we discovered in the story of Maui, when he tried to kill her to make death disappear and gain immortality, but lost his life in the process. This was in the Hawaiian narrative. In the Maori tradition, the characters are the same, but the story is quite different, and it tells us of the origins, the death of Maui, and how men lost immortality. The story goes like this. While Tane had lost his daughter and second wife, Hine, who was now goddess of the underworld, the offspring of two men, had multiplied. But they didn't know about death. It did not exist yet, and Hine was waiting for the right time to begin populating the underworld, which was still empty of souls. She could see the threads of destinies, and she knew her time would come, and that a demigod, Maui, would accomplish great deeds, but also doom every man to lose immortality and join her to the underworld after their life. Many generations passed, and men multiplied, until the birth of Maui. But as a child, as a baby, he was not wanted, and his mother abandoned him by the seashore. The baby was washed ashore, entangled in seaweed. No human being ever had had such a sad beginning to his life, and this called the attention of Rangi. The Sky Father was watching from the heavens, and he pitied the innocent baby. So Rangi reached down and took him up to the sky, where he nursed Maui and adopted the newborn. Maui spent his childhood into the heavens, and several years passed. On earth, his mother had forgotten him. Years later, as an adolescent, he appeared among his elder brothers at the family home, and claimed to be the abandoned last son. His mother refused to admit he was her child. But when he told them of how he used to gaze down from the heavens, watch their home, and listen to their voices, and that he knew all their names, and that he was abandoned by the seashore, she acknowledged that he was her last-born. She kissed him in tears and welcomed him to the family. And so Maui was adopted by his own family, but he lived as an outcast with his powers and the suspicion he raised among his brothers, who were jealous and afraid of him. They would not let him participate in their fishing expeditions until his first exploits, when one day he went with them with a magic hook and lifted the southern island of Aotearoa from the ocean floor. Then they accepted him and became his partners and support in many other accomplishments. He raised the sky, he made birds visible, he tamed the sun and balanced night and days. Many years passed, and Maui became a hero. He was very aware of his strength and proud of his accomplishments, but his family always feared for him. One day, his father told him that he was afraid that he would find a stronger opponent and be defeated. Maui asked who it could be, because to his knowledge, no one was stronger and more able to fight than he was. His father mentioned their ancestress, Hine, the great goddess of the underworld. At dawn and sunset, her light flashed just where the sky met the earth. Maui was intrigued and offended that a being could be considered stronger than him. So he asked his father whether she was stronger than the sun that he had trapped, or greater than the sea from which he had dragged the land. His father had to admit he didn't know. But Maui had been intrigued by what looked like a new adventure, and he decided to embark on a quest to find Hine and defeat her. His father told him she was a giant. Her body was that of a human being, but her eyes were greenstone, her hair was sea kelp, and her mouth was monstrous like a fish from the depths of the sea. The entrance of the underworld was between her legs, and she could force anyone to pass through it and stay prisoner forever. Maui now needed to confront Hine, and he went on an expedition with 4 little birds. They went to the limit of earth and sky, where Hine resided, and they found her in her sleep. His father had told the truth. She was even bigger than he had said, even lying on the ground, with her legs opened. She was higher than a house. The vision of her sleeping, abandoned, had something ridiculous, and the birds wanted to laugh. But Maui stopped them immediately, as waking her up would be their death. He told them that he would have to enter the body of Hine, using the passage between her legs, and cross it to exit by the mouth, because there was no other way she could be killed. It would be of crucial importance that the birds do not laugh while he was doing it, however ridiculous and disgusting this might be. The birds really wanted to laugh, but they promised, and Maui approached the goddess, still asleep. Near the entrance of the underworld, between her thighs, there were sharp flints of obsidian and greenstone, and Maui passed between them cautiously, to not make any noise that could wake her up. This was at the same time ridiculous and terrifying, and at some point, as he was about to enter her body, one of the birds could not hold back any longer. He burst into laughter. The old goddess awoke immediately. She opened her eyes and clapped her legs together, sealing the entrance to the underworld, and also cutting Maui in two. Maui had died, the first being to ever pass away, and he was now prisoner of the underworld. The moment Hine had been waiting for, since she had rejected her father Tane and become mistress of the underworld, had finally arrived. The champion of men had died, and because of his failure, all men were now mortal. The never-ending flow of their souls would populate the underworld. And this is how died Maui, the demigod, and the world as we know it was now complete. From the cycle of days and nights, to the islands of the world, to the space between earth and sky, to the unavoidable journey of life to death. These are the blessings and the ultimate curse that we inherited. We have reached the end of this journey. I will now let you enjoy sounds of the ocean for a little while. You can close your eyes and let go. Or if you don't feel sleepy, pick another story from my library. Sleep well. Sweet dreams. Au revoir.